So we are recording. This is our final nature night for this spring, and just a little housekeeping before we get started officially. We will have everybody muted so there's not much background noise. If you have questions, please put those in the chat. My colleague Jen will be keeping track of those questions, and we will hold those to the end for a question and answer session after Tim's presentation. If you're having any technical difficulties with your sound or your video, it might help to turn your video off or move closer to your Wi-Fi. Sometimes that can help with the sound quality. And as I mentioned before, we will provide the recording to this as well as any resources that are mentioned in a follow-up email. So with that, I would like to welcome you. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Columbia Land Conservancy, we are a nonprofit organization with headquarters in Chatham. And our mission is to work with the community to conserve the farmland, forest, wildlife habitat, and rural character of Columbia County while strengthening connections between people and the land. And Nature Nights started in fall of 2019 as a way to connect people to nature in the colder months and in the comfort of our office in Chatham. And obviously, we haven't been able to do that this year, but with the wonders of technology, we've been able to continue these on Zoom, and we've been very glad to be able to do that. And before the program starts officially, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. It is with gratitude and humility that we acknowledge that for those of us in Columbia County, we're learning, speaking, and gathering on the ancestral homelands of the Mohican people, who are the indigenous people of this land. And despite tremendous hardship in being forced from here, today their community resides in Wisconsin and is known as the Stockbridge-Muncie community. This land is also near the homelands of other indigenous people and First Nations, including the Schaghticoke First Nation. Indigenous peoples continue efforts to reclaim and steward the land today. We pay honor and respect to their ancestors, past and present, as we commit to building a more inclusive and equitable space for all. Thank you for listening to that. And I am going to pass it over to Tim Kennelty, and I would like to introduce Tim, who is a master gardener and a master naturalist volunteer through the Cornell Cooperative Extension. He also serves on our board and has gardened in Columbia County for more than 30 years and has developed a passion for preserving native species and combating exotic invasive species. He's been involved in multi-year habitat restoration project at the Siegel-Kline Kill conservation area in Ghent. And we are very pleased to have Tim share his knowledge about all things pollinator. So take it away, Tim.
Thank you, Heidi. So I'm going to try to share my screen and hopefully that will work. Here. Everybody can see my screen, yes?
Yes.
Excellent. I'm going to put it on slideshow. Well, thank you everybody for coming on a rainy night. It's a good time to talk about pollinators as we start planting our gardens. As Heidi said, yes, I am a master gardener and I have been gardening on about 12 acres in the southern part of Columbia County for about 30 years. And you know, as young as a child, when I was a child, I always loved, you know, catching frogs and going out into the woods and watching birds and butterflies. And I always thought that that really related to my garden, in my gardening habits and what I was planting. And about 10 years ago, I took a course on native plants and I started realizing the importance of native plants in our ecosystems. And I had been planting a lot of non-native plants and really changed my gardening practices and have been incorporating native plants into my garden in the town of Ankrum, and have seen a huge difference in terms of the amount of biodiversity, in terms of insects and birds and things like that. Um, Also combating invasive plants, which are really very detrimental to native plants, and also to the insects and the birds that are supported by them. So tonight we're going to talk about gardening for pollinators, and I should also say that many of the photographs in the presentation are photographs I've taken in my own garden. Some are a little bit more stock photos, but I try to put as many photographs in my own garden as possible. So we're going to talk about just what is pollination and who are the pollinators out there. And this is pretty much an introduction. So if there are expert pollinators out there, I hope I'm not repeating things that you already know. Hopefully you'll learn something tonight. We're going to talk about supporting pollinators with native plants. And we're going to jump into and talk a little bit about bees and wasps, and then butterflies and moths. And then I'm going to go through some profiles of nectar and pollen plants that I have found to be really superior in terms of their hardiness and in terms of their attractiveness to pollinators. And we're going to do that kind of throughout the season. So let's first talk about pollination. Pollination is basically plant reproduction. It's when pollen is moved from the male part of a flower to the female part. And about 75% of all pollination is done by animals. The rest is like oaks are wind pollinated, but much of the pollination is done by animals. It's an incredibly important ecological process, not just in terms of our own kind of commercial food production, but also for really pretty much all flowering plants out there. So what are we talking about when we talk about pollinators? Because pollinator gardens are really popular now. So who are we really talking about out there? We're talking about bees and wasps. We're talking about butterflies and moths. We're talking about flies, and there's many species of flies, beetles, and to much lesser extent, birds and bats. And in our area, it's not really birds and bats. You could argue that hummingbirds are pollinators, but they don't really serve a huge purpose. And for the purposes of our talk tonight, and I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes, so I don't have a lot of time to talk about all of these pollinators. So I'm really going to focus on bees, wasps, butterflies, and moths. If you really want to find out about flies and beetles, I'll show you some resources at the end. I know everybody's really into flies, right? So, but you're not going to hear too much about flies tonight. So let's first talk about the importance of native plants to pollinators and how they fit into this. This is actually a bumblebee on an agastache plant in my backyard, and it's just, I think, an incredible bee. We'll talk a little bit about bumblebees. So native plants, these are two quotes, one from Audubon and from the US Forest Service. Native plants are really the essential kind of link in the food web. They provide the nectar, the pollen, the seeds, the leaves. It's really, you know, the very bottom of the food web for all of the animals out there, for all the birds out there, for all the insects. And as we go through the talk, and as you explore a little bit more in your own research, I think you'll find that it's really fascinating and really intricate, the different relationships that the different organisms have with native plants. So what do I mean when I say native plant? What I mean is it's a plant that has been here for hundreds and even thousands of years, kind of pre-colonial plants. And why is that important? It's important because those plants co-evolved with all of the other organisms. And as we go through the talk, I'll talk a little bit more about coevolution and the relationships that those plants have with those, especially insects, but also birds as well. So we're really talking about kind of pre-colonial time, when these plants were out there like an oak tree, and how it was evolving over hundreds and thousands of years with the other organisms. as opposed to non-native plants. Non-native plants are plants that were brought here either intentionally or unintentionally by human beings. The example I always use for unintentional transport of non-native plants is purple loosestrife. And you probably know purple loosestrife, which looks really beautiful in August, but it's an incredibly invasive plant in our waterways. And that actually came in the ballast of ships that the colonists brought here. So that's been here since the 1600s, and they didn't really know they were bringing that here, but it has done a huge amount of damage to the ecosystem. Most non-native plants were brought here intentionally, though. They're brought here through the commercial horticulture trade because someone thought it was a beautiful plant, or someone thought it would be a good herbal medicine, or someone thought it was going to be. USDA brought a huge number of non-native plants for erosion control. And because they were kind of plopped down here and they had no relation to the insects and the birds, they really are not beneficial in most cases to those insects and birds. So it makes a huge difference what kind of plants you have in your own ecosystem, because if you have a lot of non-native plants, they're really not doing a whole lot to support the animals and the insects in your property. And I think the important piece of this, and if you take anything away from this evening, it's that, a lot of times people don't think they really can make a difference, but you really can make a difference as a gardener. And this is a quote from Doug Tallamy, who is kind of the guru, the god of native plants. He's written a lot of different books on native plants. And I actually, just before I came on, was reading his new book on oaks that just came out. I would highly recommend it. He's a really good writer and really explains things very clearly. He's an entomologist, and he basically said, in your own landscape, you can make a huge difference, especially cumulatively. If we are a little bit aware of what we're planting in our gardens, we can make a difference. And it's important because we've lost so much habitat and so much land is owned privately that it's really about you and your own world and being thoughtful about what you're planting and how you're editing out your garden. This is the traditional way we have gardened. This is certainly the way my parents have gardened, probably your parents. Even I gardened a little bit in the beginning of my gardening history. We cut down all the trees. We made our house with our little artificial lawn, and maybe we planted trees. If we did, we went to the Home Depot and we bought a burning bush or a Norway maple or a Callery pear. And guess what? All of these are invasive plants now. One of the only good things about the pandemic is there are all these free webinars out there like this one tonight. And I was at one where a native plant expert called these plants zombie plants. I'm not quite as radical as that, but they really are zombie plants in that they don't do anything to support the wildlife out there. And what they do is they push out all the native plants. So this is the way we've kind of gardened, right? And why is that? Well, look, when we go to the Home Depot, when we go to the Lowe's, and I being a total plant geek have already been to the Lowe's many, many times looking at the trees and shrubs. This is what we find generally. We find all of these plants that you would think of as ornamental plants, and that's really what they are. They're pretty much strictly ornamental plants because their origins are from Asia and Europe. And again, because we kind of transported them here kicking and screaming, they really didn't co-evolve with the other organisms. And so they really don't do much good. And I would argue some of them, like privet, which Home Depot and Lowe's are still selling, is an invasive plant. And all of these plants, for the most part, are not doing anything to support the insects or birds or bees or anything else out there. So what I'm asking you to do tonight is think about your garden a little bit differently. Take a big step back, whether you have a little piece of land or you have 100 acres. Think about your property as a whole. Think about what your property abuts up against. I'm up against a state park, so there's a lot of hardwood forest there. You may be up against a meadow. Your neighbors may have cut down all the trees, or they may have a lot of oak trees. What kind of land features do you have? Do you have a pond? Do you have a lake? Think about your, holistically. And then what do you have planted in your property? Do you have natives? Do you have non-natives? Do you have invasives? And you say, well, I don't know if it's a native plant or not. Well, it's about a 2-minute Google search almost anything is a 2-minute Google search these days, right? But it is. I mean, you really can put in the plant, and whether it's a native or non-native, and find out if it's a native to your area. And by the way, I didn't mention this when I was giving my definition of native. There's all kinds of definitions of native. Usually, I define a native plant as one in the Northeast. People can get very, very specific, and I mean, and say it's Columbia County or it's Westchester County. And that's fine, but most of the plants I'm talking about today are natives to the Northeast. Inventory your, and I don't mean by inventory to go out there with a clipboard, but some of us on the call, and I know some that I've seen in the pictures, may go out with a clipboard, right? They may go out and inventory their property and see, what do we have? Do we have bees out there? Do we have all kinds of bees? Do we have lots of different butterflies? And if you don't know what you're looking at, I highly recommend you download an app like iNaturalist and take a picture of that bee and figure out what it is. What do you have? Do you have a lot of pollinators out there? If you do, you've probably got a pretty healthy ecosystem. And then you start thinking about what you're going to do to supplement. What are you going to do in terms of plants, adding plants to your ecosystem, maybe adding some water if you don't have a water feature. A lot of times people for butterflies will insert, little cups in the ground for water for butterflies. Add some things to your environment to really support those pollinators. You want to definitely limit or eliminate pesticides and even herbicides. Some herbicides are helpful if you're getting rid of invasives, but for the most part, limit these because they're really going to be very damaging to pollinators. And then this is almost the most important thing on this slide, which is consider having a more natural garden. And that's a nice way of saying a messier garden, right? A lot of people have very formal gardens, and that's fine. But if you're pulling out all the weeds and you're cutting down all the perennial stalks at the end of the year, a lot of times what you're doing is you're eliminating the habitat for those particular pollinators. And it's usually the larval stage. I just listened to a woman named Heather Holm, who's a real expert. I'm not an expert on native bees, but she's an expert on native bees. And she talked about leaving leaf litter if you can, leaving those stalks up for perennials, because a lot of times that's where a lot of these critters are overwintering. Some of the weeds that you may be pulling may be host plants for particular butterfly species. So think about having something that's not a complete mess, but that is not completely pristine and formal as well. Okay, so we're going to switch gears a little bit and we're going to talk about bees. It's time to talk about bees now. This happens to be a bumblebee on a Heliopsis, or I think it's a Helianthus flower in the garden. So bees as pollinators, bees are like the best, most efficient pollinators of all the pollinators. Why is that? Because bees are deliberately bringing pollen back to their young. So that means that they have, morphologically, they have places where they include the pollen on their body to take back to their young. So they're actually transferring the pollen from one flower to another when they're doing that in times. They're also really hairy, so they do it inadvertently as well. They do something that's just pretty, again, amazing in nature. They practice flower constancy, which means when they go out on their foraging tour, they go from one flower to another, but the same flower in the same species. Most pollinators don't do that. So this bee, if it's going out to a coneflower, when it's out there foraging, it's going to go from coneflower to coneflower. Butterflies are just kind of, hey, what's happening? They're going to a lot of different flowers, right? But this bee is really serious. It's going from coneflower to coneflower. So it's going to be a lot more efficient in its pollination because it's going to go from one to another, and it's much more likely to transfer pollen. And they can visit many, many flowers on a single trip. So they're super duper pollinators, as opposed to some of the other pollinators, which are pollinators and important pollinators, but they're a little bit more lax. And I'll talk about those in a minute. So I didn't draw this, but this is an illustration of the life cycle of a bee. And this is pretty much the life cycle of any insect. And why am I talking about the boring life cycle of a bee, where the adult lays the egg catches into a larva, and the larva pupates at some point? The reason why is because with all pollinators, you really want to think about supporting each of these parts of the life cycle. So if you're just supporting the adult, you're probably missing out on something. And I'll go into a little bit more detail on this, but it's really important for butterflies and for bees. So this is going to be the same life cycle for a butterfly, but they're going to have different needs within each part of the life cycle, if that makes sense. So honeybees, when most people think about bees, they think about honeybees. I actually gave this exact presentation to a beekeeping group last night, and I was very intimidated with the slide because I knew they'd know a lot more than I do about honeybees. But this is all you really need to know tonight about honeybees. Honeybees are not native bees. They were brought here from Europe because they're incredibly efficient. They have perennial colonies, which means they live from year to year. They overwinter. They can be transported. So you can take your colony into an orchard to pollinate that orchard or into that vegetable field. And pretty much they're flower generalists, which means if you have honeybees to create honey, they can use a lot of different flowers to create that honey. That's pretty much it on honeybees. I mean, they are incredibly important pollinators. They've been used very extensively for commercial agriculture. A lot of people keep honeybees. They're great bees, but they are not native bees. Now we're going to talk about native bees. There are 3,700 species of native bees in North America. Doesn't that just blow your mind, right? I mean, isn't that crazy? 3,700. And the thing that's amazing, most people think of bees as being very social. 90% of native bees are not social. They're solitary. One female and one male, they mate, and the female takes care of her eggs and she takes care of the larvae when they hatch. And that's it. And some of them live only a few weeks. So 90% are solitary, which is pretty crazy, right? Most of them are flower generalists too, which only means that they don't have one particular flower, but there are really kind of three categories. Most are flower generalists. Some native bees will go to only the flowers of a couple of different species. And then there's a group that are very specific to one flower. And, you know, if you do a little bit more research, there are bees that are called the name of the flower because that's the only flower that they will go to when they're collecting pollen. And that goes back to that whole evolution thing. That bee has evolved with that particular flower, which again, mind-blowing, right? Pretty cool. Of those solitary native bees, about 30% tunnel into different nesting material. Mud or clay, mason bees, leaf material, leafcutter bees, and wood, carpenter bees. Unfortunately, carpenter bees are also tunneling into my house, the cedar house. But for the most part, they are tunneling into kind of old dead wood. So 30% tunnel, and some of them in the pithy stems of like perennials. So that's one of the reasons why you want to leave a little bit of clutter. Like for instance, goldenrod is a great stem pithy area for a lot of different bees to kind of nest in. The rest though, 70%, again, of these solitary bees nest in the ground. Again, kind of mind-blowing, right? There's all these bees nesting in the ground out there, all these native bees nesting in the ground, which is a good reason to have some area in your lawn if you're really trying to support these, which has some leaf litter, which has soil that is, you know, able to be dug in by these bees. So kind of not what you'd normally think of when you think about bees, right? And then there's this whole group of bumblebees. There's 46 species of bumblebees. And we didn't say what's your favorite bee, but my favorite bee is the bumblebee. Why? Because they're very cool. They are social. They create annual colonies. And right now, there are new queens emerging from the ground to make new colonies. They will lay eggs, and they do have worker bees then that go out and collect pollen. They're one of the only social native bees. They nest in the ground, normally in like old mouse holes and things like that. And one of the very coolest thing about bumblebees is that they are the first to be out in the spring. They're out there now. In fact, I saw them out around my pussy willows. And they're about the last to leave in the fall. And that is because they can regulate their own body temperature. How cool is that? So when you're out in October and you see that bumblebee that's kind of like looking like it's, you know, been out to the bar for a couple of hours and it looks kind of drunk, it's almost inanimate. It's because it's regulating its own temperature when it's going to get cold that night, that October night. So what does that mean? Because they're out early in the spring and late in the fall, it means you need to have something flowering from the very beginning of the season to the end of the season. And that's what we're going to talk about when we talk about nectar plants. Bumblebees, very cool. What is the difference between bees and wasps? I should have asked this before I came to this slide and see if anybody knows. Bees are vegetarians and wasps are omnivores in their larval stage. Remember we talked about the different stages? Wasps, the larva either parasitizes another insect, which is not a pretty thing, or the mother goes out and takes bits of meat from animal carcasses and feeds it to their larva. Also not exactly the most pleasant thing to think about, but that's what they feed their young because they need that protein. And adult wasps do consume nectar. They are pollinators, but they'll also eat honeydew that aphids create, and they'll also eat rotting fruit, and you'll also find them on your soda can because they just love sugar. So they're pollinators, but they don't have to have flowers. So that's the basic difference between bees and wasps. I'm not even going to get into hornets because hornets are a whole other thing. But that's the difference between bees. That's the basic difference between bees and wasps. So that's it. That's all I'm going to tell you about bees so far tonight. Now we're going to talk about butterflies because this is kind of our expedited exploratory pollinator presentation. So butterflies and moths. Butterflies and moths are really closely related. They're in the same order, Lepidoptera. What do they have in common? They both have scaled wings. And if you can see under here, their wings do have scales. They're made up of scales. They have these big, large compound eyes. And most importantly, their larval form, remember if you think about the chart with the life stages, their larval form is always caterpillar. So if you see a caterpillar, it's going to turn either into a butterfly or a moth. They tend, butterflies, the difference is butterflies, of course, this is what most people know. If you were a school child, you would know the butterflies are out in the daytime, moths are out at night. There are exceptions to that rule. Butterflies are more colorful than moths. Here's the exception. I know a lot of people were talking about the Luna moth as their favorite moth, right? And morphologically, butterflies are generally more slender bodies if you're looking really closely. Moths are generally a little bit fuzzier, hairier, and moths and butterflies have different antennae. Here's another huge difference. There are a lot more species of moths than there are butterflies in North America. It's 11,000 species of moths and 725 species of butterflies. So that's kind of the skinny on the difference between butterflies and moths. This life cycle, very similar in terms of, describing them. There's a adult, lays an egg. The egg has a larva. It's a caterpillar. The caterpillar goes into a chrysalis and it has this amazing transformation to an adult. That's kind of neat, right? But why is it important when you're supporting them? It's important because, and I don't know if you know this or not, but if you don't know this, this is the coolest thing of all about butterflies and moths. They need different plants to support them in their larval stage from their adult stage. And this is the amazing thing about the coevolution of those plants and those butterflies and moths. Butterflies lay their eggs on only very specific species of plants that they have co-evolved with. And different species of butterflies have different species of plants as their larval or host plants. And the way I describe it is trees over years and years and years have developed all these defenses, right? These kind of poisons and toxins in their leaves because they can't run away from a predator. They can't run away from an herbivore. So they've developed over the years and years and years these kind of toxins. This is an oak. It's developed toxins. And the butterflies and moths that have co-evolved with them have learned to overcome that for only specific species. So the caterpillars of those butterflies and moths are only going to eat one type of species of plant or several types of species of plant. It's pretty amazing, right? So what's really important is when people talk about their beautiful pollinator butterfly gardens, they're really talking about these flowers, right? And when you see them at White Flower Farm, no knock on White Flower Farm or any of the other places, but they're talking really pretty much about flowers, where what you really need in addition to the flowers, you need the host plants. And host plants are usually not flowering plants that much. The conspicuously flowering plants, they're usually trees and shrubs, grasses, weeds. When I talked about having a messy garden, a lot of weeds and herbs are host plants too. And I'll show you a couple of different combinations of host plants for butterflies and moths. Whereas the adults, the butterflies they need the nectar plants. They don't eat pollen, but they need those nectar plants. So when they're adults, they need nectar plants. When they're the host plant, they need larval, or when they're in their larval stage, they need host plants. I hope that makes sense. Okay, so butterflies and moths, since we're talking about pollinators, they're not the best pollinators. They are pollinators, but they are probably the least efficient pollinators because they don't gather pollen. They're just kind of like hopping around from flower to flower, kind of moseying along, and they're probably going to inadvertently drag some pollen from a male part of a flower to a female part. And remember, they don't practice flower constancy, so they may just by chance go from one cone flower to another. So they're really not as efficient as bees are, who are really, really efficient. And I think I talked about at the very beginning of, before we even started the talk, silk moths, which are those beautiful Luna and Cecropia moths, which everybody loves. They actually aren't pollinators at all because in their adult stage, they never developed a mouth part, so they don't eat at all, so they don't go to flowers. So kind of wild, right? I mean, can you imagine not eating? I really can't. Okay, so in Columbia County, and this information comes from Farmscape Ecology. Shout out to Farmscape Ecology, which is this amazing ecological group. They have an amazing website and they have all this information on butterflies and moths and bees. There's about 100 species of butterflies that have been cited in Columbia County, 650 species of moths, but of these, probably about a third of these you'd think of as being common that you would see out there. But you can go on their website and see, and it includes the species that have been cited, it includes the host plants, it includes the habitat that they can be found in. So really a lot of information at your fingertips. I'm going to take you through just a couple of butterflies and their hosts plants. And kind of the interesting thing, I was listening to a talk the other day, and not when you go to these free webinars, not all of them are completely accurate because they were talking about planting all these nectar plants. And they said, if you plant these nectar plants, that butterflies will come. Well, not necessarily, because really the habitat of this beautiful Eastern tiger swallowtail is not where the nectar plants is. The habitat is where the host plants are. They will be hanging out where these host plants, and these are the host plants of an Eastern tiger swallowtail. They're all trees, and they're all native trees because they co-evolved with them. And they're trees that like kind of wetter areas, like willows and serviceberries and black cherries. So if you don't have these, this is what I talked about, like look at your neighbor's property. Do they have these? Does the property abutting yours have these, or do you have these? If you don't, you're probably not going to see this butterfly. It's not going to just come to your coneflower because you want it to. You really need to have the host plant because the mother is looking for these plants to lay its eggs on for its caterpillars to be able to eat. Hopefully that makes sense. That for me was like mind-blowing, and now I'm out there planting lots of trees for the butterflies. As opposed to fritillaries. Fritillaries, beautiful, beautiful butterflies, and there's a whole group of fritillaries that we find in our area. Their host plants are violets, native violets. Guess what? I was digging out all the native violets from my garden because they look like weeds, right? And they spread a lot, and they're kind of in the shade, and they bloom for like a week. But this is what this particular butterfly will lay its eggs on, and this is what the caterpillar eats. If you don't have native violets, and you might even have them in your yard, go out and look for them, then you'll have fritillaries hanging out on the ironweed. So just totally different host plant from the butterfly that I just showed you. And then I include this one, and this is a little bit rare to see. This is actually, I took this in the New York Botanical Garden, but I've had them in my garden. This is Spicebush Swallowtail. And this is one giant evolution, co-evolving with only spicebush and sassafras. So if you don't have spicebush or sassafras, you're probably not going to see this butterfly. So I expect everybody to be running out to the nursery to buy some nice spice bush. It's a great plant, first of all, but it's a great bird plant. But also, it is the host plant for this particular butterfly, and the caterpillars will only eat spicebush and sassafras. And if you have, I have a sassafras tree, and you see them kind of rolled up in the leaves of the sassafras tree, kind of later in the season. Pretty amazing, right? Then I include this one. This is actually my favorite moth. This is a clearwing hummingbird moth. These you will see out in the daytime. So what does that mean? It means the rule about moths being out at night is not really completely always right, right? This is a moth that you see in the daytime. They almost look like a small hummingbird. They're the absolute coolest thing. And if you have these host plants, and I think there's a couple more too besides this, but again, black cherry is an amazing host plant. Hawthorn, native honeysuckle, not Japanese honeysuckle. You'll see them. I mean, this is basically their larva is going to be eating this, but you'll see them on your flowering plants, and they're just amazing. They're just like the coolest thing. I include the slide just because this is from the information's from Farmscape Ecology, but lots and lots of different varied host plants. And a lot of times what you'll find is a flowering plant like an aster, which is a great nectar plant. Also, it could be a host plant for a lot of different butterflies. What I recommend you do is decide which butterflies you want to have in your garden and plant the host plants. You want to make sure you have some nectar plants, but you really need to have those host plants. Any good butterfly field guide will tell you the host plants for that particular butterfly. And as I said, Farmscape Ecology has it as well. So host plants, really, really important. And I have to throw in the birds into this because, again, this is all about this coevolution. Here's some really nasty looking caterpillars on one of my trees, right? These are going to turn into a moth, right? But also, and this is the coolest thing too, this is the main food that most terrestrial birds feed their young when they are fledging. Why? Because caterpillars are high in protein, lipids, and carotenoids. So again, caterpillars are not just turning into moths and butterflies, but they're this incredibly important food for nesting birds. And again, that means if you're planting lilacs or something else that's from Europe or Asia, you're not getting your caterpillars. And it's all about opportunity costs, right? So I have lilacs in my garden. I'm not telling you not to plant lilacs, but if you plant the plants that the caterpillars are going to eat, you're also going to have the birds and the butterflies. It's just, I mean, it's amazing to me. And it's kind of one of those things that you, a little bit mind blowing when you start thinking about how important native plants are to the whole ecosystem. And the more diversity you have, so the more different types of host plants and trees you can plant, the more different types of birds and butterflies you're going to have. Does that all make sense? I hope. Okay, we're going to switch gears here, and hopefully we're not getting into a lull. That's why I'm going to show you nice, pretty pictures of flowers now to wake everybody up. But these are the nectar plants that I really recommend highly for supporting all of these pollinators. And again, if you take anything away today, it is try to have something blooming throughout the season. And when I say flowers, again, I'm not talking about just daisies. I'm talking about thinking a little bit more broadly about this is a red maple flower, right? It's kind of pretty, right? And the red maples are blooming now. Mine are almost past. If you drive up the Taconic, you see all this kind of shades of red. Those are the red maples blooming. And that's a really important pollinator flower for the emerging honeybees, and anything that's emerging right now needs to find something to eat the nectar of. And this is one of the first emerging flowers that support them. So let's talk about March and April. Trees and shrubs really important in March and April as nectar and pollen flowers. This is serviceberry, which is an excellent wildlife plant in all ways. It's a good host plant, it's a good berry plant, but it's also a really good pollinator plant. Spicebush, again, Really good early pollinator plant. I happen to hate forsythia now because it's kind of not, it's a zombie plant, I think. I'm sorry to say. I have it out in my front. I put it in my vase in the front entranceway and it looks nice. But Spicebush is a really, it's what I would say is Spicebush is like forsythia on steroids because it's also this amazing native plant that supports a lot of different pollinators. Same with redbud, really amazing. But probably the best of all are native willows. Pussy willows, black willows, beaked willows. Go out and buy some willows. Um, I have pussy willows and they're covered with bees. They have been covered with bees. The flowers are just about done with those right now. Also an incredible host plant for a lot of different butterfly species. But again, Heather Home, the bee expert that I was listening to, said basically native willows, and I'm not, no weeping willow, that's a European willow. The native willows are probably the most important pollinator plant for this type of time of year. So if you have any kind of wet area, and I am rooting pussy willows right now. So if anybody wants some pussy willows to plant in their yard, it's really a great plant for pollinators. And don't forget about spring ephemerals. These are spring wildflowers. Since I'm talking to Land Conservancy folks, a couple of the PCAs have beautiful, beautiful spring ephemerals. These are really good pollinator plants. Virginia bluebells, spring beauty, my bloodroot's blooming right now. It blooms for a very short period of time, but it had bees all over it because the bees are looking for pollen. And this is really, you know, what's out there blooming right now. Again, native. And these will kind of disappear in the heat of the summer. So you can plant them among other things. They like kind of richer soil and a little bit shadier soil, but all of these are really nice. I just was out to my sister's house in Syracuse, and she said, "What are these kind of funny leaves that are growing in my yard?" Well, it's trout lily, and it was blooming just naturally in her yard. She hadn't planted it or anything else. Pretty amazing, right? They have these beautiful flowers, and they're great pollinator plants. May and June, let's move a little bit further into the year. And May and June, you still want to think about shrubs. Any kind of native shrub that blooms in May and June, and many of them bloom in May and June. And we're talking about ninebark. We're talking about viburnums, and be very careful with viburnums. Even some of the master gardeners have asked me about what viburnums are native and what are not. Some of the European viburnums they're finding are very invasive. So I'm talking about arrowwood, I'm talking about black haw. I mean, again, do a little bit of research, but there are a lot of really nice native viburnums, really good pollinator plants, chokeberries, really good pollinator plants, all the different native dogwoods. This is pagoda dogwood, but there's flowering dogwood, bunch of dogwood shrubs, all different conditions, wet conditions like, what is it, silky dogwood, which is really nice, has a nice flower to it, has a nice berry to it. And again, all of these, they're kind of like triple threats because they're usually good pollinator flowers, they're good host plants, and they also have berries for the birds in the fall. So it's like you really can't go wrong. So don't plant a lilac, plant a nice native dogwood. And then there's some really nice perennials, and I'm not showing you every single one of these, obviously. I'm giving you a few examples. This is one of my favorites for kind of late spring, early summer is goat's beard. I don't know if you're aware of this plant, but it is, again, all the plants I'm showing are really hardy, which I hate perennials that they say are hardy and they don't come back again. This comes back every year, almost if you don't even want it to. It likes a little bit of shade and rich soil. It has these really nice feathery flowers covered in bees because that's what they're finding in May and June. This is kind of April, May-ish. I really like goat's beard a lot. It's a really nice plant. And then if you want to have a ground cover, these are sundrops, which are native too. That's, I mean, I'm giving you a common name, but the Latin name is up here as well. Again, it's a host plant to a couple of moss species, really good pollinator plant, comes back year after year. Even if you can be really rough with this plant and it still comes back and spreads nicely, not super aggressive. So a good example of a nice pollinator plant for the early part of the summer. And then of course, milkweeds, right? We must plant milkweeds. These are, there's a couple of different milkweeds. There's our common milkweed, which me just go back and show you our common milkweed. That's it, our common milkweed, which a lot of people think of as a thug because they're a little bit aggressive. I think they smell beautiful. They're really, really, really important plants because they're the host plant for monarchs, but they also happen to be terrific, terrific nectar and pollen plants. This is marsh milkweed or swamp milkweed, and this is butterfly weed. And note that all of these plants, the common names have weed in them. It's not because they're weeds. It's because when the colonists came here and gave them common names, they were all over the place, right? And so they thought, oh, they're weeds because they're all over the place. But they actually, many, many of them, they get a bad rep. They're actually really beautiful flowers. I love both of these. And this one likes drier, and this one likes a little wetter conditions, but really excellent pollinator plants, June blooming. And then we move into July, where we really jump into all the, really nice perennials. This is a kind of bedraggled cone flower in my garden. And as you can see, it's it's the pollinator buffet, because this is a skipper and this is a bumblebee. But there's a lot of, all the really nice native perennials that bloom in July are generally really good pollinator plants. Coneflower, not really native. When we talk about native being local to our area, it's not really local to our area, but it has basically become a native in the sense that people plant it so much, and it is so beneficial to pollinators. It blooms for a long period of time, really easy to grow, of course, in a lot of different soil conditions. Fairly deer and rabbit resistant, although once in a while they'll touch it, but incredible for native bees, incredible for butterflies. And it's a beautiful plant as well. One note about this particular plant, they have hybridized it like crazy. And the double versions of these, what happens when you create a double flower is a lot of times what you'll do is you'll use up some of the reproductive organs of this plant. So some of the doubles have very little pollen and very little nectar. So try to get closer. If you're really using this as a pollen plant, try to get closer to the native species like this one. Bee balm, one of my favorites. It's called bee balm because the bees love it, the hummingbirds love it, the butterflies love it. It's deer and rabbit resistant because it's in the mint family, and we know that because it has a square stem. But there's a lot of different colors and a lot of different cultivars grow really easily in our area. This one likes a little drier. This is wild bergamot. This is the kind of typical bee balm. But they spread, but they're not aggressive. One of my favorite flowers, hands down. Really, really good. And spreads, so you're not, I was just at a nursery today, because as you can tell, I'm a complete crazy person. And the perennials were $25. Ridiculous, right? So you want one that spreads, or you want one that self-seeds. This spreads, you can plant 3 of these and have, a huge patch of them. This may be one you don't know about, but it's an incredibly important pollinator plant, mountain mint. And this is anything in the Pycnanthemum family. I love this plant. It's, again, in the mint family, isn't eaten by rabbits and deer. It's a little more subtle. It's got this really beautiful silver foliage throughout the season. It has really subtle flowers, but covered in pollinators. Spreads, again, nicely planted around a pond, planted, in your perennial garden. Really, really nice pollinator plant. And then I have to include a shrub. This is buttonbush. Buttonbush, one of my favorites. Not the most beautiful bush, and I'm not putting down buttonbush, but the flowers are, look how incredible these flowers are, right? And I guarantee you will have tons of swallowtails if you have the host plants, and bees on this if you have buttonbush. You can plant this directly in water. I have this in the outflow of my pond. Loves wet, but also can take typical garden soil too. Host plant to a couple butterfly species. Again, why plant something that's non-native, that's not going to support these, when this is a host plant and you've got all this activity around this particular plant? And then let's talk about kind of the end of the season, which is almost the most important, because the pollinators really need sustenance out there, especially if they're going to overwinter as adults, like a mourning cloak does. So you'll need things like Joe Pye weed. This is, again, a really reliable plant. Don't get frustrated in the spring. It's not up yet. It's one of the latest ones to come up. But because you know, I'll get very impatient. I'll start digging around, and then I'll realize that I've dug up my Joe Pye. Wait, you don't want to do that. But these can be anywhere from 3 feet to 6 feet tall. I have a particular one that's 10 feet tall. It's enormous. Really, really good pollinator plants. Again, really good for bumblebees. Um, really nice garden plant. Again, one of my favorites, and I know somebody in the chat said, oh, I can't name my favorite butterfly. I can't name my favorite perennial. This is one of my favorites. This can get to be enormous too. In the back of the border, this is New York ironweed. This one also will self-seed, so you get little planties in the spring that you can move around and not spend $25 on them. But it has these really nice purple flowers, blooms for a decent period of time. Oh, and I should say, this is one, you know, you'll see things about long-tongue and short-tongue bees. This is one that the long-tongue bees love because it's got these kind of tubular-y flowers, but really, really nice. Has this kind of blue-green foliage. Great perennial flower. Goldenrod that gets a bad rap, but because of Canadian goldenrod. And again, back to the, you know, keep a not so pristine garden. If you do have Canadian goldenrod, which is pretty aggressive, and you have a little patch of it, just leave it there because it's an amazing, amazing pollinator plant. But there's some beautiful cultivated species of goldenrod too. You know, I get obsessed with a particular species of plant, and I bought all the different kinds of goldenrod. There's some really nice goldenrod species out there, and you know, this is going to be humming with pollinators if you have it. And then asters as well. Asters, great nectar plant, can take dry, drought conditions, not completely tolerant of rabbits and deer. So think about that. But there's lots of different species of this, lots of different cultivars, beautiful. And then finally, I'm not like a big annual guy myself, but annuals do serve a purpose for pollinators if you're kind of in between blooms. So, you know, your zinnias, and this is what most people think of as pollinator gardens. So you don't want to just plant annuals, your zinnias and your cosmos, but this is the best, I think, annual pollinator plant. And this is Tithonia, or Mexican sunflower. It's beautiful, beautiful orange blooms. 4 feet tall in one season, something like that. A little bit harder to find out there in the nurseries, but it's, again, it's just like huge butterflies on this and huge bumblebees and things like that. So plant some annuals. Okay, we're getting near the end now, folks. So when we talk about pollinator gardens, it's such a, you know, it's a loaded term. Think about a couple of things. This is the High Line in New York City. This is the New York Botanical Garden native plant garden. I could tell you this is my backyard, but it's not. And what you want to think about is what they've done is they planted kind of large sprays of one particular plant because of that constancy of going from one plant to another of the same species. They've also planted their nectar plants by their host plants. So if you go, and I really highly recommend going to both the High Line, which has lots of native plants, and the New York Botanical Garden native garden. These are all native trees and shrubs, which, by the way, are the host plants for the butterflies that are eating the nectar and then going to lay their eggs there. So it's a really good idea, if you can, to have host plants as close to your nectar plants. See, this is a garden at my house where we have some nice phlox and things like that, but a lot of different host plant trees in the background as well. So just think about where you place your plants as well. Just a tip on that. And, you know, this is just an introduction, hopefully, for you. I, again, am a book crazy person. So there's lots of different butterfly field guides out there. This is an excellent book if you're interested in pollinators. This is by the Xerces Society, Attracting Native Pollinators. And this is if you're just become a complete butterfly geek, this book by Check and Tudor, which I think you can get a used copy of this on Amazon because it's relatively expensive, is kind of the book on butterflies of the East Coast. But there's also these just terrific websites, Farmscape Ecology, as I said, the Xerces Society has a great website, and this is, if you're interested, if any of this piqued your interest, to do a little bit more research. And please, when you go to the garden center, be thoughtful about what you're buying. If you're planting a tree, try to plant something that's native to support all of these pollinators. My I guess my kind of final pitch here is these are all critters in my garden, right? These are all pictures I've taken, and I have these because I've tried to create a habitat with native plants that support these, and it really does work. If you plant these plants, you really are going to get a lot more biodiversity, and it's just so cool to see all these things in your garden. So I mean, Heidi, if you think we have time to have questions, I'm sorry I've talked a good deal of time here. I am a master gardener, so you can always send a note to either our Acre office or our Hudson office. But since there's such a small group of people, you can also just email me directly if you have a question. Here's my email address. And also, if there are questions tonight, I'm happy to answer them if you think we have time, Heidi.
We definitely have time. And thank you so much, Tim. I feel like I learned so much, and now I just want to go and dig up my yard and plant all the trees and the flowers. I actually have a couple of buttonbush is my favorite shrub as well.
Buttonbush, yeah.
I have a different connection to it. The turtle species that I worked on that I studied lives in buttonbush kettle swamps.
There you go.
But they have the flowers are amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there was, people have questions, throw them in the chat. There was a couple that came through so one was about this idea of the messy garden, and do you have to worry about ticks more so in a messy garden?
I'm not necessarily saying that you should just like have complete, like free for all. I think if you can leave an area that's a little bit wild, if you have enough land to do that, I wouldn't necessarily suggest you walk through that area all the time. But if you can leave a little bit of a messy area, and I'm really talking about things like leaving some leaf litter in your garden. You don't have to leave it on your lawn. So, I mean, you want to be very cognizant of the fact that there are ticks out there, and you want to protect yourself with your clothing and everything else. I'm talking about your garden itself, not so much the Adams family where you walk out in and there's no lawn at all. So yeah, I mean, you definitely have to be cognizant about ticks. I myself, and I'm not saying that everybody else should do this, anytime I go out in the garden I wear permethrin treated clothing, just because I've had Lyme disease like several times, so I don't want to get it again. So yeah, you have to be aware of that, definitely.
Okay. And then, oh, here's a question from Teresa. My trees are saturated with gypsy moth cocoons. Leave them or no?
Well, gypsy moth, some will be eaten by the birds, but I would get rid of gypsy moths. That's the one larva that I would try to. I mean, if you can kind of hand pick them, I wouldn't spray them or anything if you can avoid it. But yeah, I mean, I wouldn't leave those for the birds. I mean, the birds will eat some of them, but they're pretty destructive.
You mentioned that there was a couple of bees that only pollinate one flower. Do you off the top?
And I can't tell you off the top of my head what they are, but they're I mean, I can't tell you that tonight, but there are certainly some that are very specific to a specific flower. Not and they're kind of esoteric flowers too, as I remember.
You said that you weren't going to go into hornets, and
but here it comes, right?
yeah, I just need to know, are they pollinators?
They generally are not. They're and the reason why hornets get a really bad rep because they do sting you, and a lot of them are kind of paper wasps and hornets. Some of them are native, some of them are non-native, but they're generally aggressive when you get near their nests because they are social. So yeah, hornets are generally not big pollinators. No. I mean, and the other thing that people always ask about are yellow jackets, because when you think about ground nesting, you think of yellow jackets. Again, they are social, so they have multiple worker yellow jackets and things like that, and they have that distinctive yellow and black, and they will sting you because they're protecting their nest. But that's not what we're talking about when we were generally talking about native ground nesting bees. And most native bees are not going to sting you anyway. Some of them don't even have stingers that will penetrate skin, because when they're out there hanging out with the flowers, they're really not going to be destructive unless you really, really harass them. And, you know, you get one caught between your shirt and your body or something like that. They're not going to sting you. They're not aggressive.
And the really chubby bees that you're seeing right now, or that I'm seeing right now, are those the carpenter bees?
The gigantic ones are carpenter bees, yeah.
Okay.
And those are males usually. I don't know this from researching this. I know this from researching my house because they're eating my house. Yeah, they generally won't sting you either, but they come flying right up to you because they're trying to get you away from the nest. You can actually hear the females eating the wood because they're so gigantic. It's kind of creepy, yes. But they're native bees, and you know, they're really I mean, their main habitat is kind of dead logs and things like that. But that's, you know, if you have a wooden house, it's a dead log, right?
I guess, yeah, pretty much.
It looks like there's a question about, do you think wasps will be attracted to the spotted lanternfly dew?
That's a great question. I don't know the answer to that. I don't think so, because really when we're talking about honeydew, we're talking about aphid honeydew usually that they're eating. I wish that was the case, but I don't think that is the case.
Okay, and then there's another question about, you mentioned that there are some host/nectar herb plants. Any suggestions?
You know, well, the herb plants that I can think of are black swallowtail, anything in the parsley and carrot family. And again, parsley and carrots are really not that native, but that's the family that they lay their eggs on. And the other one that's kind of, and I'm trying to think of which butterfly it is, but one of them, the host plant are elms and nettles. And so again, I'm not suggesting that you keep all your stinging nettles, because we don't like stinging nettles, right? But that's, again, like I have like a wild kind of area that I don't go into, and there's stinging nettles in there, and I leave it there because it's a host plant. So yeah, parsley, carrots, anything in that family, and then nettles, and there are non-stinging nettles too. Grass.
Is dill one? Is dill?
I think it is. I think it's in that same family. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it is. And a lot of the grasses too, the skippers, a lot of the skippers, the host plant, are like little blue stem grass and some of the native grasses.
And I know you said, like you mentioned, doing a quick Google search as you walk around your yard, and also mentioned the iNaturalist app, which I'll bring up again in a minute. But I'm going to ask you because you're right there. Are the white violets also native and the host? They are. Okay.
Yeah, anything like that you find out there that's a violet, that's kind of a weedy thing. And again, it's so weird because I was just talking to my sister, and she was like, I'm digging all these violets out of my garden today. Yeah, anything like that, because they also kind of, I think they interbreed the purple and the white, because you get some that are kind of half white and half purple. Those are all native violets. And again, I'm not telling you to plant them in your garden, but if you have them, like I have them in my lawn, and I have them kind of at the edge of my garden, I just don't get rid of them anymore, because, and I have tons of fritillaries in the summertime on my nectar plants. I have tons of them, and that's why.
Cool. All right. Do we have any other questions in the chat?
Don't be shy.
We're also a small group. Feel free to unmute if you'd like to just ask Tim a question.
It has to be about pollinators, though.
Oh. I'll cross that one off my list.
It actually doesn't. It can be a gardening question. That's fine too. Dara, I knew you had a question. I knew you had a question. See, come on.
As soon as you open it up to general gardening questions.
Uh-oh, the pressure's on now, huh?
It's in terms of, you mentioned, go to garden centers and be mindful.
Mhm.
And, we have to do this and be mindful. Some of that takes planning ahead, right? And I find one of my biggest challenges is, keeping track of timing, when to plant what.
Mhm.
And, I find it a little easier to do that in terms of seeding for vegetables, and, that you have to be really particular about your timing.
Mhm.
With, the flowers, of course you do, but sometimes you forget, or you're inspired by something that's in bloom and you, I'd like more of that, but
Mhm.
it's the right season. Do you have a tip or a trick? So I've tried spreadsheets, and of course that's,
Really? I'm surprised you've tried spreadsheets, Tara. This is what I will tell you. I usually am planting trees now in April. Trees and shrubs is a really good time of year. And also September, October is a really good time of year. However, you can plant in the summer. You just have to keep it watered. I mean, it's a lot more stressful to the tree or shrub. And I plant my perennials like from now through, I would say, the end of May. And then I also plant perennials in the fall as well. And a lot of the nurseries will have their perennials on sale from like September on, and you can get them very cheaply. And as I said, perennials are really expensive, and trees and shrubs are expensive. So fall's a really good time to plant. You just have to make sure, I would put some kind of protection around them. I mean, I don't love mulch, but something like that so they don't heave. I mean, you can plant things in the middle of the summer, but you just have to really make sure that they're well watered. So you don't, there's no wrong about planting anything, Dara. There's nothing wrong about it. And the other thing is, don't beat up on yourself. I go to the garden center without any plan at all, and I say, "Oh, I like that," and then I find a place to plant it. That's, I mean, see, I mean, that's what you do.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Don't have guilt.
I feel like I heard somebody on a podcast say something very similar, that like, plant it when you can plant it, because it's one of those things. I am notorious for buying like a dozen buckets of perennials, and then I never have time to plant them all, so they get planted in like succession over like a month, and some of them survive.
And that's okay. And that's okay. And with a lot of perennials, it takes a year or two for them to really establish anyway. I mean, if if you plant it if you don't plant it in May and you plant it in June and you say, "Oh, didn't do anything," it's probably not going to do that much the first year anyway. It might bloom, but it's not going to spread. And with trees, a lot of times you won't see a lot of, really kind of nice growth. It's a bit of a shock to plant it. So you won't see that for a year or two anyway, or the third year, you really start seeing the plant develop a lot more. So it's really fine. It really is fine to do that, especially if you see something you really like and you know where you want to plant it. It doesn't really matter in terms of, I mean, I planted my Christmas tree that I brought in. As long as you dig a hole, you can plant your Christmas tree out there in December if you bring the dirt into your house, which is also crazy, but you can do that. I mean, you can do that and it's doing fine.
Are you saying you dug the hole back in like October?
I did. I know.
It's fantastic.
Call the men in white suits, but that is what, I mean, I planned it, right?
Yes, you did.
Yeah.
You do a spreadsheet for that, Tim?
Yeah, this is why we get along. See, that's the issue.
Exactly.
Anything else? And honestly, if you think of something, please feel free, because I know there's not that many people on the call. So feel free to send me an email. I'm happy, especially to answer questions about native plants. I mean, I really love to go out there and proselytize about them. So please ask me questions if you think of something after our session ends tonight.
It looks like we have a few more questions rolling in now. E asked, that they have really large green caterpillars that are eating all the leaves on their roses. And they wanted to know if you knew what they were and how to keep them from coming back. They hand remove them and get them all, but they keep coming back.
Well, hand removing is good. You know, roses are really, I think, challenging to grow because they have a lot of pests. I would have to see a picture of them. I mean, that's kind of unusual to see caterpillars on roses. I'd have to see a picture. If you send me a picture and we can try to figure it out. But you know, it's one of those situations where roses do need a lot of care. I mean, my father had a rose garden. He sprayed it like crazy. I don't think you really want to use pesticides on it, but you know, they do have a lot of pests. They have a lot of pests in terms of aphids and other, you know, Japanese beetles, all kinds of things like that as well. So hand picking is the best thing you can do, and you know, if they like it, they are going to keep coming back probably. I don't know. It's not very satisfying, I know. I gave up on roses because I'm just not a good rose grower myself.
Teresa asked if you can recommend an app that helps one keep track of bloom times, notes about pests, weather, insects, something like a garden diary.
I don't know of a garden diary. It's funny you should ask me about bloom times though, because somebody asked that last night. And I have to check with Cornell if there is some kind of a site that has bloom times for a lot of different plants in our area. So if I find it, I'll send it on to Heidi and she can post it, or we can get it to you. But I don't know of a good like calendaring app. I actually keep a journal, a hand journal myself, and I find it to be really helpful because it certainly indicates bloom times, but it also indicates like past years when pests have come in or when we've had a droughty time and things like that. It's helpful to keep a record of things like that if you possibly can.
So there's the one app that I do know of that it doesn't do all of those things, but it can track, it's a phenology app. So it's a way to track all of these things that you've been talking about. It's called Nature's Notebook. And it goes into this big database called the National Phenology Network. And we'll put a link in the follow-up email. But yeah, so once you start tracking, you pick your species that you want to track in your home. We're actually setting up a phenology trail at Borden's Pond Conservation Area that we'll use sort of for educational purposes and to track and yeah, so you can put in the bloom times, when the leaf's out and all of that stuff. And then on their website, they've got all of these really cool visualization tools. So once you have a few years of data, but you can also look at, there's a couple of other phenology trails. Farmscape Ecology has one. I think you can look at their data and see, but I can share some resources about that because there is some information about bloom times for different species.
Pat asked if you favor white clover over thyme in the lawn.
I don't really have an opinion on that. I don't really pay attention to my lawn, to tell you the truth. I mean, it's an awful thing, but I have less and less lawn because I just keep, and I don't really, fertilize or anything like that. So, if you're talking about kind of native ground covers, one of the things I did was I ripped up some lawn and I planted like wild strawberries, which it's a great ground cover. Sedges are a great ground cover because again, both of those are host plants for some butterflies, and the wild strawberries are really good nectar plants too. So I think the thyme is it's a non-native. It's fine. I mean, I think it's totally fine, but it can kind of take over too.
Liz asked if rhododendrons are native.
There are native rhododendrons and there are native azaleas, but most of them you find in the garden centers are not. But there certainly are. There's a lot of native azaleas. I don't think they're native necessarily to like Columbia County. They're probably more like mid-Atlantic, but they're perfectly nice. They're perfectly nice flowers. And again, you can find out very easily by just a quick Google search, but there's some really pretty non-natives. The really bright purple ones are not. Like I thought of this today because I went to service my car in Rhinebeck, and I drove through Rhinebeck, and it was beautiful. And there were a lot of kind of brightly colored shrubs, and they were all non-native. And it's just, I mean, it's just one of those things where it's fine and it's pretty, but they're not really doing anything for the environment.
Someone else asked about crabapple trees, if they're a good choice, or what would be a good native evergreen choice for a visual barrier?
Those are really two really good questions. Crab apples are not technically native, but they are, I mean, they're a good plant to plant because they're good pollinator plants, and also they're good bird plants if the fruit on the particular cultivar is small enough. If you get really big ones, they're not great because the birds can't eat them. And if they're persistent, if they kind of persist, because one of the really important things about crab apples is they kind of shrivel up and they desiccate, and they're really important food for kind of late winter, early spring. So yeah, they're good. I mean, I have crab apples and I think they're perfectly fine, but they're not technically native. There's so many hybrids of them and things like that. And you said a native, that's so funny because again, somebody was just asking me this question too. Native evergreens, there's a native spruce, a white spruce is native. White pines are nice, although they can be eaten by the deer. There's another spruce that's native too that I can't think of the name of, and there's cedars are red cedars are native. There's red pines. Yeah, I mean, and I don't think there's anything wrong with planting a non-native spruce because it's a great shelter for birds and things like that. If you want to make a shelter area that, wind shelter or something, I don't think there's anything wrong with planting something like that, certainly.
And then there was another comment about someone not getting any butterflies anymore, but still getting plenty of moths, and why that might be.
That's really interesting. I would think it's all about your host plants. I don't know. Or if maybe you're planting so many host plants, trees that you have shade, and then you don't have flowering plants, because you do need to have flowering plants. I mean, if you have a big area of flowering plants and you also have like an oak tree supports 500 species of moths and butterflies. If you have an oak tree, you're probably going to have some butterflies and moths.
And then someone asked about Pachysandra.
Pachysandra.
Oh.
There's a native Pachysandra and there's a non-native Pachysandra. Non-native is super, super aggressive, kind of hard to get rid of once you have it. There's a native Pachysandra too that grows much more slowly, kind of hard to find. There are a lot of non-native ground covers that really take over, like vinca and ivy. I have vinca that I just can't get rid of, and ivy, and Pachysandra's one too. If you can try to reduce it some, it's probably a good thing.
And earlier you had mentioned about making sure that you have water and other things for pollinators. And someone asked if a bird bath can be a water source for butterflies.
Yeah, definitely, absolutely. There are butterflies that like to do puddling. I don't have a picture of it in this presentation, but I have a butterfly presentation. There's a butterfly called red-spotted purple. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's a beautiful, beautiful butterfly, and they love to puddle. In fact, you don't really find them. They are nectar butterflies, but you find them on the ground all the time because they like to puddle. So yeah, bird bath is great. People even insert cups in the ground, which it seems a little crazy, but yeah, bird bath's fine, totally fine.
I think that's all the ones I see right now at the moment.
Really good questions. Heidi, you get people who have great questions. Kudos to you.
Well, what can I say? It was a very compelling presentation, and we will, as I said, share all of these resources and a link to the recording. We do have a couple of things. So as I mentioned, this is our last nature night for the spring. We'll pick them back up in the fall, and we'll send an email out in maybe next month asking for ideas for content. But in the meantime, we do have a BioBlitz going on at High Falls Conservation Area. April is Citizen Science Month, and so this is one way that we're participating. It is a COVID-friendly activity, and I'll put a link in the presentation, but basically we're just asking people to go out on a sort of digital scavenger hunt and take pictures of the plants and animals that you're seeing. This goes into the iNaturalist app, which goes to, helps us at the Land Conservancy manage the property as we know more and more about what's there. So it's really fun. You can go out with your family and you know, friends, and it's a safe way to collect data. And then also we were able to get some native plants from the Xerces Society as part of these habitat kits, and we'll be planting those probably in mid-May. We haven't figured out when we're picking them up yet, but we'll probably be looking for some volunteers to help with that. And it'll be a great opportunity to learn more about these native pollinator plants, and we'll keep you up to date about that. And so I think that was all on my list, but we appreciate everybody joining us this evening and look for an email early next week with more information. And we'll make sure Tim's email is in there for everybody to send their questions.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a good night.
Thank you.